Okay, good morning, sophomores. This is it, our final week together. Of this year. You guys, I hopefully will see again next year. It looks like last time I checked, I am getting to teach all of the juniors. So I should have each of you, no matter where you fall on the CP honors AP scale. I should get to see all of you again that are coming back. I hope all of you are. Um, we may be in for a little bit more chaos next year, but you know what? We're going to get through it just like we did this year. And I hope that each of you will get through it with me because it's just not the same if I don't have you guys. Y'all have been a rock this whole um, quarantine period. Most of you doing such a good job and getting a lot of good feedback from you guys. So I'm looking forward to some more time with you. But let's get started on our final section of sections of the five people you meet in heaven. And it starts off with we left off in the middle of a section with Ruby from Ruby's Pier being Eddie's third person he visits. And she's giving him a little insight into his father. She actually ended with, we had an Eddie's birthday thing, but we also, because that's going to come back to pay off later. But basically, we've been told she's there to tell him about his father. Now, this third lesson is going to revolve, and that's the title of the section we're starting on, page 77. The third lesson is going to be about forgiveness, but let's see what happens, all right? So the woman starts asking him about, did you really hate the pier that much? And here's what Eddie says. He says, it wasn't my choice, Eddie said, sighing. My mother needed help. One thing led to another. Years passed, I never left. I never lived nowhere else. Never made any real money. You know how it is. You get used to something. People rely on you. One day you wake up and you can't tell Tuesday from Thursday. You're doing the same boring stuff. You're a ride man, just like, and then he trails off and she says, your father? And he just says nothing. So then we get into this conversation with his father. And this is going to be probably, by the way, this section we're reading today is one of the more powerful ones in my opinion, but it is also one of the sections that readers have the most issue with. All right. Ruby's take on Eddie and his father's relationship is very contentious. A lot of people feel like this is not the way it's supposed to go. But when you look at it in context of what she's saying in the third lesson, it makes perfect sense. So what we need to learn how to do is to, when you see something that you disagree with, don't immediately close down and say, no, this is stupid, that's wrong, and shut down for everything. Let the whole thing permeate. Let it all get through your brain and see what all of the extra circumstances are to see, okay, now see the point they were trying to make, all right? So Ruby points out right away, she says, your father was hard on you, and she tells Eddie, maybe you were a little hard on him too. Now, the relationship we've seen up to this point, it just seems like Eddie's dad was a big jerk. And there's nothing to make us think Eddie has done anything to deserve it. But there is more to this, okay? It says, Eddie gets mad. He points out, hey, my dad's final words to me, but remember, his dad lived for a long time after this and never spoke to his kid. His final words were, get a job. He says, that's it. I didn't get any final, like, I love you. No good memories with my dad. It was get a job. And then years later, he dies. All right. The woman, listen to what she says. Says the woman pursed her lips. You began to work after that. You picked yourself up. Eddie felt a rumbling of anger. Look, he snapped, you didn't know the guy. That's true, she rose, but I know something you don't, and it's time to show you. So she points out that, yeah, your dad said that, but guess what? He had come back from the war and was in this like spiral of self-pity and was doing nothing with his life. She's like, after that, you did. You got up and did what you needed to. And he's like, well, you don't understand everything. And she points out, no, I don't, but I know something you don't. And then she's going to point out something from Eddie's past. And this is the hardest part of the book to read, as far as it's a really bad scene, okay? Not bad written. It's written excellently, but it's a tough one to read. But basically what we find out is that this guy, Mickey Shea, who I told you was going to be a big payoff in this story later, is a major player, had been fired from his job. He had an alcohol problem. He got drunk. He came over to see Eddie to get Eddie to beg for, not Eddie, Eddie's father, to beg for his job back, not to see if Eddie's father would go and plead for him. And he had drank too much, and he tried to rape Eddie's mom. It's a really rough scene, okay? You guys see worse on some of the garbage you watch on Netflix. So, but at some point, Eddie's father comes home and sees this, and it looks like he's about to murder Mickey Shea. Mickey runs out and Eddie's father chases out after him. Now, Eddie didn't know anything about this. He finds out, and it's just like, oh, great, thanks for showing me that. Why would you do that? But the old woman lets him know there's more to show him, and she shows him that, Mickey at some point, there's a storm going on, falls in the water, and Eddie's father comes across that. Now, I'm just going to be 100% real with you guys right now. If that had happened to me and I had seen some guy doing that to my wife and I saw him fall in the ocean, the only reason I would pull him out is so I could kill him myself. All right? There's no way I would save this man. And I know this about myself. But Eddie's dad does. He pulls this guy out of the water and saves him and does not hurt him after what he just saw. Now, like I said, this is a really contentious thing. A lot of people would feel like, well, that just shows you Eddie's dad is a terrible person. He doesn't defend his wife like this. But this is where we get to the point of this lesson. Ruby points out, let me find it. We're on page 80 right now, and Eddie basically, or end of 79, Eddie says, what is he doing? And Ruby said, saving a friend. Eddie glared at her. Some friend? If I'd known what he did, I'd have let his drunken hide drown. Your father thought about that too, the old woman said. He had chased after Mickey to hurt him, perhaps even kill him. But in the end, he couldn't. He knew who Mickey was. He knew his shortcomings. He knew he drank. He knew his judgment faltered. Says, but many years earlier, when your father was looking for work, it was Mickey who went to the pier owner and vouched for him. And when you were born, it was Mickey who lent your parents what little money he had to help pay for the extra mouth to feed. Your father took old friendships seriously. Yeah, hold on, Lady Eddie snapped. Did you see what that was doing with my mother? I did, the old woman said. Sadly, it was wrong, but things are not always what they seem. So Mickey had been fired that afternoon. He'd slept through another shift, too drunk to wake up, and his employers told him it was enough. He handled the news as he handled all bad news, by drinking more, and he was thick with whiskey by the time he reached your mother. He was begging for help. He wanted his job back. Your father was working late, and your mother was going to take Mickey to him. Mickey was coarse, but he was not evil. At that moment, he was lost adrift, and what he did was an act of loneliness and desperation. He acted on impulse, a bad impulse. Your father acted on impulse too, and while his first impulse was to kill, his final impulse was to keep a man alive. Now, this, again, like I said, is a problem for a lot of people, especially in the culture we have today, where this kind of behavior is never to be excused. And to be honest with you, I agree. But what we're getting from this, it's not to focus on it's okay what Mickey did. That's because it's not. And there's nothing in this book that tells you it was. But it's just like letting him understand that there's more going on than what we see. And that, what Mickey did was just a horribly bad choice that it impacted everyone involved dramatically. The most dramatic, actually, is Eddie's dad. All right. She points out that you remember last week when we talked about Eddie's father dying of pneumonia, this is how he got it. He got ill from saving this man who had just tried to harm his wife and force himself upon her. He pulls him out of the ocean, saves his life, and in the process will lose his own because of that. We talked about sacrifice in the second section. That sacrifice, again. And think about how, Eddie's captain's sacrifice was for his men and his friends. Eddie's father just sacrificed himself for a guy who, for all intents and purposes, he should not be friends with anymore. But because of what he did and because of how he had helped him, he does save him. I love the ending of this section, bottom of 80 to page 81. It says, the old woman repeated, his body had been weakened, the ocean had left him vulnerable, pneumonia took hold of him, and in time he died. Because of Mickey, Eddie said. Because of loyalty, she said. People don't die because of loyalty. They don't, she smiled. Religion, government, are we not loyal to some such things, sometimes to the death? Eddie shrugged. Better, she said, to be loyal to one another. And I love that. She points out that he died for a good thing. It was because he was loyal to this guy. This guy had done a lot for him. And yes, he made a bad choice. And to be honest with you, if Eddie's father had survived and Mickey survives and they have this conversation, there's probably a lot of issues to be settled between these men. Some might involve a fist to the face. But she points, and Eddie says, well, we don't die from loyalty. And she points out we do. And she gives some examples of things that we die for a lot of the times. Religious things, for a government, for a political belief. And she points out that sometimes it's better to die for another person than it is for these obscure things. Now, not obscure, that's not the word I'm looking for, these other elements, all right? Kind of an interesting statement. It says, after then, the two of them remained in the Snowy Mountain Valley for a long time. And so they're just letting Eddie process this. He does ask what happens to Mickey. And she points out he died alone, drank himself in the grave, and he never forgave himself for what happened. He died sadly. Then Eddie, he struggles. He's like, why didn't my dad ever say anything about it? She says, he never spoke of that night again, not to your mother, not to anyone else. He was ashamed for her, for Mickey, and for himself. In the hospital, he stopped speaking altogether. Silence was his escape, but silence was rarely a refuge. His thoughts still haunted him. So from this point on, his dad never speaks to anyone again, and he lived for a little while. But he says, he didn't want to embarrass his wife. He didn't want to embarrass Mickey. He didn't want to embarrass himself. He just decided this didn't need to be said. Um, Said the mother would stay with him for days and days and listen to him moan in pain and keep blaming herself for what happened. But here's kind of a part of the death he didn't get. Just finally one night at the doctor's urging, she went home to sleep. Early the next morning, a nurse found your father slumped halfway out the window. Wait, Eddie said, his eyes narrowed. The window? Ruby nodded. Sometime during the night, your father awakened. He rose from his bed, staggered across the room, and found the strength to raise the window sash. He called your mother's name with what little voice he had, and he called yours too, and your brother Joe, and he called for Mickey. At that moment, it seemed his heart was spilling out, all the guilt and regret. Perhaps he felt the light of death approaching. Perhaps he only knew you were all out there somewhere in the streets beneath the window. He bent over the ledge. The night was chilly. The wind and damp in his state were too much. He was dead before dawn. So he realizes that in the last moment, his dad did want to have these people close to him and make some sort of reconciliation with them, but couldn't. Cool little final line. It says, which was worse when left unexplained, a life or a death? And Eddie realizes that, there's so much with people that we don't understand. No, that doesn't excuse their actions. There's so much going on with people that you think are just terrible people. Maybe you've had a relative who's been like Eddie's dad, who's just a hard person, who shows no love for anyone. And you look at them and think, man, this is just a terrible human being. The fact is we don't know the whole story about people. We don't know what's made them the way they are. And a lot of times if we did, we would feel totally different. Eddie's got a pretty good question, though, as we're on page 82. He asks her, how do you know all this stuff? And she points out that this was a shared hospital room. Her husband, Emil, was dying next to him. So she saw all of this going on, and she kind of knew what had happened. She says, I heard her moaning. She's talking about the mom. This is Ruby talking about Eddie's mom. She said, I heard her moaning on those lonely nights. We never spoke, but after your father's death, I inquired about your family. When I learned where he had worked, I felt a stinging pain as if I had lost a loved one myself. The pier that bore my name, I felt its cursed shadow, and I wished again that it had never been built. That wish followed me to heaven, even as I waited for you. So she points out that she finds out what happened and how this location indirectly impacted Eddie's family. And it was so strong in her that was one of the people she wanted to meet and to guide to heaven because she felt so bad about what happened. So let's see. There's a little more. The actual lesson still. And she delivers this at the top of 83. It says, Ruby stepped toward him. Edward, she said softly. It was the first time she had called him by his name. Learn this from me. Holding anger is a poison. It eats you from inside. We think that hating is a weapon that attacks the person who harmed us, but hatred is a curved blade, and the harm we do to ourselves. She says, forgive, Edward, forgive. Do you remember the lightness you felt when you first arrived in heaven? Eddie did. Where is my pain? That's because no one is born with anger, and when we die, the soul is freed of it. But now here, in order to move on, you must understand why you felt what you did and why you no longer need to feel it. She touched his hand. You need to forgive your father. Okay? And there's our lesson. The lesson's about forgiveness and about hate. Hate is something that does not impact the person you hate. It just doesn't. If you're angry at someone and you decide to get back at them, what you're really doing is doing more damage to yourself than them. You may indirectly and momentarily cause them some heartache, but at the end of the day, you're the one who is dwelling on this feeling, and you're the one who just will not let this out of your head, and it's doing more damage to you than it is just to forgive the person and move on. And forgiveness is key. We have to learn that a lot of times when people hurt us, it's not as intentional as we think. It's not like they sat down and maliciously were like, I'm going to get that person today. Now, sometimes that happens. You forgive those people too. And you forgive and you move on, because otherwise you're just allowing that pain to continue. And that's what she's telling you. Like, you've got to forgive your father. The final part of today's reading is actually that. It's, Ruby kind of disappears and Eddie goes into the diner and sits down and talks to his dad. Now, his dad doesn't talk back. He just tells him, he's like, Dad, I was upset with you. You did all this stuff, but you're still my dad, and there's still a good person in there beyond all that, and I want you to know I forgive you, and I'm going to let it go. His dad still, I I was confused by this, guys. Let me tell you. Let me read the section. It says he leaned in close, and we're talking about Eddie here. He saw his father's dirty hands. Well, see, that's the problem. This is a writing issue. Okay, it's you don't want to overuse pronouns when you're dealing with like Eddie and Eddie's dad. So when we see his and he, you're not always sure which one he's talking about here. This is probably the only part of the story I have a really big like grammatical issue with. All right. Let me back up a little. It says, his voice wobbled until it was high and wailing, not his own anymore. Okay, you hear me? He screamed, then softer. You hear me, Dad? Now that's Eddie talking. I know that. Then it says he leaned in close. So I don't know who leaned in close. Is it Eddie or Eddie's dad? I don't know. It says he saw his father's dirty hands. Okay, so maybe it's Eddie if we're going to repeat the he, but it doesn't have to be. It says he spoke the last familiar words in a whisper. It's fixed. Eddie pounded the table, then slumped to the floor. When he looked up, he saw Ruby standing across the way, young and beautiful. She dipped her head, opened the door, and lifted off into the jade sky. I don't know who says it's fixed at the end. It could be either of them, but it's probably Eddie would be my guess because his dad doesn't talk. And but once he says it, whoever does say it, Ruby is gone, and that's it. And that also ends this section, and it's going to start the fourth person that Eddie's going to meet. Which of the five he meets, this fourth one is the one who is the most important to him. All right, going to spoil it for you. He's going to meet his wife, Marguerite. She's going to be the fourth person, and this is a really, to be honest with you, of the five, it is not my favorite. I like it. I think it's good. I think it's the weakest of the four for several reasons, and that's really odd, but it kind of fits with what we're working with here. All right, so we're going to close there. Tomorrow we're going to pick up with him meeting his wife and some of the stuff that goes on with that, and we're going to be building to the end where he meets this final person and he gets the real revelation about his purpose, what he was here for, how he impacted the world, and kind of a cool twist at the end. Okay, all right, I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you for sticking with this, those of you still watching it. The numbers keep going down. I realize that some of you are just like, 5 videos of 20 minutes, 30 minutes each of Mr. Morris is just not something I want to deal with, and I get that. You don't need me for reading this, but I hope you're watching, and I hope you're getting a little bit more out of it, and I hope you're getting, it's not really a discussion because you're not getting the answer back, but I hope you're at least, enjoying a little bit more, making you think about what you're reading, and giving you a little more insight, okay? All right, guys, enjoy your day, and I will see you for the next video.